Welcome to the Pocket. I'm your host, Scooter, and today I am presenting to you my very first fantasy football video of the channel. We're going to be talking about the best landing spots for the running backs in this year's draft class. Now, of all the topics that I've covered so far this year, power rankings, weekly predictions for the money lines, getting into the offseason with, some draft profiles for position groups and things like that. This is the topic that I am certainly the most confident in out of any of them. What I've found over the years and, just going through my own experience, this is what I have found has worked in terms of predicting fantasy football running back success. And a lot of it comes down to circumstances. So that's what this video is all about, is what situations are best for these running backs to step into and succeed right away, no matter who they are. If you're more interested in who I think are the actual best running backs in this year's draft class, go check out my top 5 running backs in this year's draft class video. I also have some honorable mentions in there. I do a really good job of breaking them all down, where I think they might go and everything like that. If you already know how this works and you don't want to hear me blabber on about what makes a landing spot good and what types of running backs there are in the NFL, then go ahead and use the timestamps and skip ahead to when I first start talking about our first team. All right, so before we dive into the criteria that makes each team a good fit for a new rookie running back, let's talk about the 3 main ways that a young running back can contribute right away on an NFL team. So the 3 main ways are being a third down back, being a goal line back, or being a workhorse back. So what are all 3 of those things? Well, it's a way to describe the way that running back gets their volume. What is volume? Well, that's the amount of opportunities they get with the football, right? Are they getting a bunch of carries, right, and running the ball a lot? Are they getting a lot of targets and receptions and working as a bit more of a receiving back? And are they getting valuable touches near the goal line where they have an opportunity to score? So that's what these 3 different ways to describe running backs are used for. So let's start things off with goal line backs. These are your big, strong running backs who you use mostly on the goal line to score touchdowns when you just need 1 yard, or they chew up the early down work on first and second down. Those touches, the first and second down touches, are not super valuable, but the touchdown ones obviously are the most valuable because you get 6 points out of scoring a touchdown. So they operate the best on teams that are winning, because in a positive game script, you're going to be running the ball on early downs. You're going to be obviously winning, meaning you're scoring more, so they'll have opportunities to score. These types of players are pretty high when it comes to their floor, their weekly consistency, but their ceiling is pretty low since they are essentially getting 0 work in the receiving game. A great example of a guy like this is David Montgomery, who finished as RB18 last year. And these guys are typically no more than emergency safe starts, unless if they're on a team that has a great offensive line and a great offense like the Lions do. In this case, you have David Montgomery, who, although he got injured, was essentially probably the most consistent RB2 on the season. And a typical stat line you could expect from a guy like this is, say, 250 carries, right? So taking a lot of the workload on the ground, probably breaking 1,000 yards. And since they're used on the goal line, they'll get like 8 rushing touchdowns. But in the receiving game, they'll get a couple receptions, like 15 or something like that, totaling up for 100 yards. But if they get a receiving touchdown, they're lucky. And so you could tell they're not really getting any volume in the receiving game, but it's all on the ground and near the end zone. So that's your goal line backs. For third down backs, these are your smaller, shiftier running backs. And instead of third down back, it might be easier to understand if I say receiving back, because that really is what they are. And in fantasy football, depending on if you're in half PPR, which is point per reception, or PPR, which is point per reception, this can be way like super important or not quite as important if it's standard scoring. But I think most people do at least half PPR. So yes, getting a reception, far more valuable than a carry, because even if you get a catch for 1 yard, that's still 1.1 points compared to a carry for 1 yard, which is just 0.1 points, right? So these guys are going to get all of your explosive plays. And like I said, your running back pass plays like check downs, screens, on the ground. They'll get the more explosive plays like draws and toss plays, but they're probably not going to get the goal line work. So these guys are best in losing game scripts. So if you're losing, you're not going to be running the ball as much on first and second down. You're more likely to drop back to pass, and that's going to leave the running back open for an opportunity for a check down because chances are the defense is going to be backed off. So what happens with these guys is they have a higher ceiling, but definitely a lower floor since their workload isn't as guaranteed. If their team is winning, then they might not even need to be out there on first and second down, getting no work on the ground, obviously not getting their opportunities for checkdowns and things like that. So they're a lot less consistent. But when they are in a losing game script, they might get, say, something like 12 carries for 100 yards, right, with an explosive run, and then an additional 6 receptions for 60 yards, and then maybe a touchdown in the receiving game. So that's obviously going to be way more than your goal line back is going to contribute on their average week. And a great example of this is Alvin Kamara, who finished as RB9 last year, even on an awful team like the Saints. Like I said, you don't have to be on a great team as a third down back to be successful in fantasy. You just need the volume and the receiving game. And almost it's even better that they're always losing because then he has no reason to not be on the field. He's going to have more opportunities to get receptions than carries, which we want for guys like this. But Kamara's stat line in his career, did you know he's never had over 1,000 rushing yards? And he still finishes as a top 10 guy pretty consistently due to his receiving floor. So a typical stat line for a guy like this is, say, 200 carries. That's even kind of a lot. 800 rushing yards and maybe like 5 touchdowns, but that's probably even a little generous. Then 60 receptions, way more than the 15 that your typical goal line back would get. 500 receiving yards, so adding to their scrimmage yards, and then 4 receiving touchdowns. If that's what they specialize in, then they'll probably get, a bunch of receiving touchdowns. You could say a guy like Devon Achane's also a receiving back. And in this year's draft class, a good example of that is going to be Travion Henderson and Travis Etienne. For the goal line backs, good examples for them are going to be Cam Scatterboot and Damian Martinez. Sorry, I forgot to mention those guys before. And then finally, we're going to talk about my favorite archetype, and that is going to be your workhorse running backs. This should be everyone's favorite archetype, really. I mean, they're more expensive than the other two, but they're well worth it. These guys are not just big running backs. They're not just explosive. They're both. So they get all of the work. They get all of the volume, and volume is king. So the offenses that use these sorts of guys, it's like they're the go-to guy in gotta-have-it situations, right? Whether it's on the goal line or third down. So they're going to get a ton of that volume, like I said. And because of that, because volume's king, they have the highest ceiling and the highest floor. Because if they don't have a great week, they still probably got a couple receptions and, close to 20 carries on the ground. So unless if they had a really bad game, they're probably scoring at least 12 to 15 points for you. And maybe the only drawback is because they're getting the ball so much, they might have a bit of a higher injury risk. But usually these guys are pretty freak athletes. Like, take, for example, my examples, Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley. What you get when you have guys like them on good teams with good offensive lines, you get a top 10 scorer in fantasy football that year. An example of what their stat line might be is like 300 carries. They're getting all of the work on the ground, 1,400 yards, and then like 8 rushing touchdowns. But don't forget their receiving game too, like another 50 receptions, 400 yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns. So that's your workhorse backs right there. In this draft class, we got Ashton Genty, obviously the best guy in the class. He's going to be a workhorse. Omarion Hampton, Quinshon Judkins, and some might even say Cam Scatterboot. Now, some people have questions about his speed, but what I saw from him in the receiving game and just his general effort on the field might be impressive enough to be a workhorse. If you're interested in what archetype I think each of the running backs in this year's class are, then go check out my video, Top 5 Running Backs in this year's draft class, where I break all that sort of stuff down. And now let's get into the actual criteria for the teams themselves. We've talked about the running backs, how they can all be different and contribute in different ways. Like I mentioned, we have broken down the running backs already. So let's talk about what makes a team a good landing spot. First of all, we talked about volume. Volume is king. So who are they competing with for that volume? Who is their competition for touches? Obviously, it doesn't matter how good you are or how great your situation is. If you're getting half the amount of opportunities that someone not quite as good as you is getting, you're still probably not going to outproduce them. So competition is just number one. Number two is the offensive line. Not only for the passing game, for quarterbacks, I always go on and on and on about how important the offensive line is, but there might not be a position that it is more important for than running back. Because if you're getting hit in the backfield before you pick up a head of steam or are able to make someone miss, then you can't do anything as a running back. And we've seen time and time again, teams go from bad teams with bad offensive lines to good teams. Like this year, a bunch of running backs did that. Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, all far improved the production that they had previously had either the season before or where their trajectory was heading. So offensive line, obviously extremely crucial, and it sort of blends in with the culture. You could have a great offensive line, but perhaps it's great in pass blocking, right? And you're not really a team that's focused on running the ball or playing like really hard defense that sort of, blends well with running the ball. If you weren't aware, teams that play really good defense and sort of identify with that tend to run the ball more to chew up clock to reduce the amount of time there is to score. So if you're a team that's like that, chances are you're going to give a running back more opportunity, more volume than a team that's passing the ball all the time, has a bad defense. And, well, at the same time, those are sort of your third down back teams, but you understand what I mean. They're still not going to get that many carries on the ground, so the consistency week to week is not going to be there. And then finally, I will talk about what I imagine the ceiling and floor would be for a running back on this team, considering how good all of, like I said, their offensive line, their offense, their coaching and culture, how much opportunity is going to be available to them, and all of that. So now, finally, without further ado, let's start talking about the best landing spots for running backs in this year's draft class. We will be starting at the bottom of my list and working our way up to the top. We have 9 teams that I will be talking about today, and the first of which is going to be the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, what do I think the Steelers need? Well, they just moved on from Najee Harris and brought back Jaylen Warren, so that means they're going to need a power back to complement Jaylen Warren. If you're going to keep a third down back on your team, then you're probably not investing into a workhorse. So I think it makes sense for them to try to go out of their way to acquire a power back. It's also cheaper. They have other needs on their team, so they can't really afford, I think, to spend a first-round pick on a workhorse running back. But either way, so like I said, I think you're looking out for the Steelers to pick up a power back, and let's talk about their situation. So for me, you look at the competition. We talked about Jaylen Warren. So you have competition on third down, and you're probably not going to get that work. The offensive line was really, really banged up last year, so it didn't quite develop to the level we thought it could. It's currently below average, but the culture is an established old school culture. And this is sort of something we saw out of the Steelers with Najee Harris, where he would look really bad sometimes, but they would always stick with him. And at some point in the season, he would start to have a consistent stretch of, having consistent games for you. So that's that old school mentality of theirs coming through, playing hard defense, chewing up the clock on offense. Arthur Smith is their offensive coordinator. He always says he wants to run the ball 50% of the time on offense. And just looking at the Steelers in general, it's not as much about, they have such a great offensive line and a great offensive scheme. I just think the volume, if they draft a power back, is going to be handed to this guy. He is going to be handed all of the goal line work, all of the early down work. He's going to be a cheap replacement for Najee Harris, and this is probably a dude that whoever it may be that they end up drafting is not going to go very high in fantasy drafts. Probably someone you could take a late round flyer on if you want to go RB0, right? You got to throw a ton of darts at guys like this. And yeah, they won't enter the year, I think, without a big guy like this on their offense. So I just think this is something that's really easy to project. I'm still not sure if they feel the same way that they need a power back, because Jaylen Warren has been good for them in years past. They do still have Cordero Patterson, who has been effective near the goal line. So if they don't pick anyone up, I would say, hey, maybe you keep an eye out for Cordero Patterson, but he's just getting so old that I'm not confident that they're going to use him or keep him with the attention of him being the only guy. So to me, this defense, the culture, it just screams that they want to run the ball, and I don't think they're going to let Jaylen Warren do that by himself. So they're going to pick up a power back, and he could potentially have the upside of, say, 8 to 10 rushing touchdowns. A lot of this depends on if Aaron Rodgers ends up signing with the Steelers, which obviously would increase the floor of their offense. Aaron Rodgers loves running the ball and having play action and things like that. And his running backs get a lot of volume out of the backfield too in the receiving game. So even though you got Jaylen Warren for that, Aaron Rodgers is no stranger to dumping it off to a big guy too. So that's why I think the Steelers are my 9th best landing spot. Up next, we will be talking about our number 8 team, and that is the Los Angeles Chargers. What do they need? A receiving back. They picked up the guy that just left the Steelers, Najee Harris. So they have a power back, but they don't really have an established receiving back. So who else is there? Well, you have Kamani Vidal, who was a rookie last year, and maybe he could get it done. But just based off of what we saw last year, usually running backs hit the ground running. We saw Dobbins able to succeed, and Vidal did make a couple of good plays, but I just wouldn't be surprised if they brought in another guy since this draft class is so talented. But if they want to fill out this room, like I said, they need a true receiving back, someone who they know can specialize in that, so they can rotate him with Najee, and perhaps Kamani Vidal can just be a well-rounded third string running back. And you just go back to think about the years, right, where Justin Herbert had an Austin Eckler, right? And the scheme might be different now, but Herbert learned very well from Phillip Rivers to use his satellites and dump it off to them, especially if they're great playmakers. So I also want to mention that there's not a lot of good receivers at all on this team or tight ends. So a lot of that satellite check down stuff is available to go to the running back. So I want to keep an eye on the Chargers in this year's draft class, sort of like the Steelers. I don't think they need to take someone early. I think they could maybe go for a workhorse, but I don't know if you want to do that after just picking up Najee. I'm pretty sure he is only on a 1-year deal, but I think they have other needs that they might want to address with their first round pick. And if they just need to add depth or a role player, then I don't really think, a first round pick is too necessary for them. Now, the offense and the culture and all of that, well, the offensive line is good. It's improving in the interior, and it's something I expect them to attack in the draft, maybe in the first round, right? Pick up like a Greg Zabel or something, or Tyler Booker, and add a guard to really help fill out the rest, because they have the tackle duo, but they don't really have the interior built up. So the offensive line could be better, but it's got a great foundation. As far as the culture, it's old school Jim Harbaugh, right? Play hard defense, run the ball, be disciplined. So that is very, very good for running backs. Should be plenty of volume to go around for Najee and whoever the third down back is. And then the offensive, just in scoring in general, how much opportunity are these guys going to have to score? Well, this receiving back wouldn't have much potential at all near the goal line. He really wouldn't. That would be Najee Harris territory. Jim Harbaugh is going to stubbornly use him, whether he's efficient or not, as the goal line back. But this Chargers team, although the defense looked good at certain points early on in the year, I think it was a bit overrated. I think it had a bit more to do with the schedule, to be honest. And I think you're going to see a lot more games this year that look like their Ravens game last year, where they were playing a really, really good team. And, maybe they were starting to get blown out, but they started to catch up. And I think that could be a game script that would be very, very good for a receiving back, like we've seen with Austin Eckler in years past. So this could be a cheap draft pick. And with the uncertainty with Vidal being in there and Najee Harris, this could be a guy who's like the Steelers situation, very, very cheap, maybe even the last pick in your draft, but it's someone you need to keep an eye on, because the opportunity and the role specifically is going to be up for grabs. Nobody is going to be competing for him except for Kamani Vidal. So my number 8 team, best landing spot for a running back, is a receiving back going to the Los Angeles Chargers. Ceiling, floor, I would say it's tough, because without any of the rushing touchdowns, I think they're going to be very limited. But we saw a guy like Chase Brown, even though he did eventually start to get some goal line work, finish in the top 10, I'm almost certain, of running backs this year. So I think you could say somewhere near, since their offense isn't going to be quite as good as the Bengals, I would say the ceiling would probably be like an RB12, maybe even RB10 if something like Najee Harris got hurt. I'm not considering injuries for the ceiling and floor, because that changes everything. But then the floor is very, very low. Just like the power back for the Steelers, it could obviously not work out. They might not win the starting job. They might not be better, considering they are a lower draft pick. So the floor is a little bit lower, but hey, it's one of your last picks in the draft. The upside is definitely going to be there as an RB2. So number 8, Chargers. Up next, we have my number 7 team, and that is going to be the Cincinnati Bengals. Last year was the first year they had without Joe Mixon, and they moved on to Chase Brown and Zach Moss. Now, good news is it did work out with Chase Brown. He looked very explosive as they used him more and more throughout the year. He was more and more productive. But Zach Moss, kind of aging at this point in his career, had some injuries, didn't have much depth behind him. So the power back role is wide open. And I want to just double down on the fact that I said was their first year without Joe Mixon. And you saw what happened to the Bengals early on this year. They had a horrible start, much like they always do, except this was their worst one they've ever had. And I think a really big sign of that might have been the confusion and the lack of consistency in the running back room. Trying to figure that out early on, especially with, they had contract situations and stuff too. But I just think that stable run game that they had with Joe Mixon, since he was so good, was something that they leaned on more than they realized. But now you have Chase Brown, so you don't need a workhorse running back when you already have a quality receiving back. So what do they need? They need a power back. So why do they need a power back? Well, as I just explained, they already have their receiving back, and you need that element to your offense, and it's going to add more consistency on first and second down. What kind of situation would a guy like that be stepping into? Well, we know that the Bengals basically had a top 3 offense last year, especially once they got going. They may have very well been the best offense in the NFL. So even though their offensive line isn't really all that great, although they've been trying to improve it, it's just still not on the level of the other better offensive lines in the NFL. The opportunity just for touchdowns is just so enticing to me here. This was something a lot of people said last year, not to mention Joe Burrow's the quarterback, all the checks and audibles that he's going to be able to do to, put the guy in the right situation if he's on the field is also something I like. I think them realizing that they needed a stronger, more powerful running game is going to change their approach to this year a little bit. All of their guys are already signed, so I think the Bengals are just going to be better this year. And even though this scheme, just the way the Bengals are kind of always being in shootouts with a bad defense, is definitely going to favor Chase Brown more than not. But that doesn't mean that this power back isn't going to have value. Like I said about the Steelers and the Chargers, this guy could be a very late round pick for you in your fantasy drafts. But the difference is the Bengals offense is going to score way more points than the Chargers or the Steelers. So although the Chargers running back, I'm saying, is going to be a receiving back, he's going to have, definitely more potential for that volume, but he's not going to score as many touchdowns as this guy is. And the Steelers guy is in the same situation, except the offense is way worse. So he might get more yards, but definitely not as many touchdowns as this guy would get. So I wouldn't say I'm like uber confident that the Bengals feel like they need this, but I'm saying if they do go ahead and do this, then it is really signaling to you that they have a specific role and job for this guy in mind, and that's going to be to score touchdowns. So I don't think their offensive line is going to be on the, say, Lions level, but this is going to be like a David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs situation where you have that thunder and lightning. And on an offense like this, that's not something that I'm just going to watch pass me by as my draft comes to a close. So my number 7 best situation and landing spot for a running back is a power back going to the Cincinnati Bengals. And up next, we've got a bit of a tier jump. All right, we're going to be talking about my number 6 team, and that's going to be the Minnesota Vikings. What do you mean, Scooter? They already have Aaron Jones. Well, guess what? Aaron Jones is a very old vet, and I'm not saying he can't be productive this year, but he definitely wasn't reliable enough between the tackles, and with the injuries and stuff like that, I think they really need to add depth. And why not add a guy who complements the skill set of your current starting running back and add a power back? So, as I mentioned, you're going to have competition in the receiving game. Aaron Jones is there. But here's the good news. The offensive line is great in Minnesota. And they also just added Will Fry. So it's going to get even better. The culture there is elite because they run that outside zone scheme that Kyle Shanahan, has spread around the NFL that is so good for running backs because they set up the play action by running the ball. So that's what they want to do first is run the ball, and these guys are going to get a ton of volume. And if a power back goes, even though Aaron Jones is going to be used for the more explosive stuff and perhaps the more valuable touches between the 20s, if this guy ends up being the goal line back, then I am so excited. I cannot wait to see how many touchdowns this guy would score because, as I mentioned, this Vikings team is going to be all about running the ball. Also, they have a pretty strong defense led by Brian Flores that, although they've had some holes in the roster, they've managed to really, really confuse some teams. This is going to keep a power back into a good game script. The Vikings did win 14 games last year with Sam Darnold. So even though he's gone, I'm pretty confident that whether it's J.J. McCarthy or maybe Aaron Rodgers, even though he said he doesn't want to go there, that that guy isn't going to have much trouble at least being in a competitive or winning game script most of the time. So that's going to favor the power back, as he's going to get consistent yards, probably, not one touchdown every week, but something close to that. And yeah, why not kill two birds with one stone? You need depth in the running back room. Add someone who complements the skill set. And I could just see this guy getting tons of touchdowns and consistent yards. What do I think his ceiling and floor would be? Well, let's take like a Damian Martinez, for instance. Maybe he goes in like the fourth round to the Vikings. I think a guy like that could score like 10 touchdowns in the Vikings and maybe get like 800 to 1,000 yards. Receiving game, probably closer to that, like 15 receptions at best. So not very high ceiling week to week, but definitely a high floor. And when you look at the Lions and what they were able to do with Montgomery, the first year that they did that, a lot of people were low on Montgomery. And I feel like this is a good enough running game and culture. And, I believe in them enough that, this is what they want to do. If you know who the Vikings are, then I think this guy could be pretty valuable. I'm not saying take him in like the sixth round or anything, but I think maybe, I got Montgomery in the seventh or eighth round. It's also a potential keeper if you play a keeper league. You could keep the guy for the next year when maybe Aaron Jones isn't there anymore and he becomes the RB1. It's another way to get value is predict when they're going to be the starter the next year. But yeah, I think you can get this guy maybe around seventh round, eighth round, depending on who it is. And it could end up being a very valuable pick for you as you'll end up starting them in your flex and they'll be your backup RB2 when they're really producing like a normal RB2. So that is my, what did I say? Sixth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that is my sixth best landing spot for a running back. Vikings pick up a power back. Up next, we got my number 5 best landing spot, and that is going to be the Kansas City Chiefs. And they're going to need a receiving back. Why? Well, because in the power role, the goal line role, they already have Isaiah Pacheco. Now, he did get injured last year, breaking his leg, but he was able to come back in the season, and he didn't quite look the same. But I think after a full off seasons of rest, he'll be about as good as he's going to get moving forward in his career. So I'm not too worried about him in that role. But in the receiving game, I think they definitely need someone. They were scrambling with guys like Samaje Perine last year, and it just wasn't working out. And I think they really missed that element to their offense. I think all of you already know who the Chiefs are. They have an elite culture. Their offensive line is great, definitely better in pass blocking than run blocking. Their defense is really, really good. So they're winning all the time. Their defense is really good. High incentive to run the ball and play it safe. And that's what they do. So guys like Pacheco have been very valuable picks with the exception of last year where he got injured. But even before he got hurt, he was a valuable pick. So I think it's very clear that the running back on this team is going to get a ton of opportunity. Not to mention potential pending suspensions for Xavier Worthy, Rashee Rice. Kelsey's retirement might be looming. This Chiefs team is going to have to completely restructure how they view their weapons in this offense. Who is going to be the leader, the guy that Patrick Mahomes can always trust? And this just gets me going back to thinking about the days when Patrick Mahomes was starting his first year. And he had guys like Kareem Hunt, you know what I mean? After that, it was like Damian Williams in the Super Bowl, guys who were able to do both, but were probably, you know, better receivers, I would say, than runners. I mean, Hunt is pretty good between the tackles and still is, but when he was with Mahomes, he looked like one of the best receiving backs in the league. And I just think this is something this team is really, really missing. I mean, nothing looked easy for them in that Super Bowl, and even most of the regular season, where they were kind of winning games nonchalantly and slacking off. I think having a good running back to close it out really would have helped them. So I think this is something they actually want to do and add an explosive element to their offense. And so I've really laid this out to you that I think this is a really, really strong situation for a running back, even though they will be winning most of the time, more often than not. I think the receiving back is still going to get mixed in for explosive creative plays, especially with, the guys like Worthy and Rice, Kelsey potentially not being there. I think this guy is going to become, maybe a focal point of the offense because chances are he's probably going to be more explosive than Pacheco, and he could be trusted with a lot of the work near the end zone. Now, that's not typically what happens with receiving backs, but if he's more explosive than Pacheco is strong, sometimes that is the way it shakes out. So although I think it's a best situation, best case scenario for the Chiefs to pick up a receiving back, I also want to mention that they could just go ahead and move on from Pacheco and get a workhorse back, right? Like someone like Omari and Hampton. That would help just as much, in my opinion. If not, this would be way higher up the list. I'm just not too sure if they feel like that's something that they need to do while they still have Pacheco. But if they're going to do this, then the ceiling is pretty crazy. I'm not going to underestimate the Chiefs. This guy could very well get 60 to 70 receptions for over 600 receiving yards and 5 to 6 receiving touchdowns. Now, how much work he's going to get on the ground is tough to say with a guy like Pacheco, but I would say he's probably going to get at least 100 carries, right, if he ends up being this good. And then maybe like another, 400 rushing yards on the ground and maybe like 2 rushing touchdowns right off of like jet sweeps and stuff like that. So not very consistent week to week, right, because he doesn't have the rushing yards. But in the games that he goes off, he's going to go off. And remember, that's the average. The ceiling wet is crazy, right? If this guy takes over and becomes the RB1 of this team, he could very well be the number one running back in fantasy. This is a good offensive line. Patrick Mahomes is your quarterback. Andy Reid's your play caller. You have a great defense. Like, this is probably one of the most underrated situations. It just depends really how much they believe in Pacheco. So if they end up cutting him or trading him or something like that, you might as well move the Chiefs up to number 2 or number 1, because that's how good of a situation this is. Up next, we've got a new tier, and that is going to be the tier of teams that need a workhorse running back. They just need one guy who can do everything, because the competition is either very beatable or they're just ready to take that next leap as a team and things like that. So even though you might have better teams or better situations below you, like the Chiefs or the Vikings, if you're just not going to get the volume on that team that these guys are going to get, then you're just going to get drowned out. And there's not much you can do. You might even be way better than the other running back, but it is what it is. So starting things off with my number 4 best landing spot for running backs this year, we have the Las Vegas Raiders, and they need a workhorse. The competition there is very beatable. You got Raheem Mostert and you got Zamir White. And I'm not too worried about any of them being better at any role compared to like the workhorse running backs that are in this year's draft class. The offensive line is better than you think. It's not good in pass pro, but they're actually pretty good in the run. And the culture change there is pretty big. They're going to that old Seattle culture. They got Pete Carroll going over there, bringing Geno Smith along with him. They have Brock Bowers, so they have a tight end. The only thing they're missing is a workhorse running back. They need their beast mode. So, like I said, not worried about Raheem Mostert. The culture is shifting. They do have a good defense already from what Antonio Pierce left behind for Pete Carroll. And Pete Carroll is going to get those guys fired up too. So I like the direction that is going. And a lot of people would tell you that they need wide receiver help. And the first round at pick six is going to be too early for them. But they get their pick of the litter of offensive help for the most part. And I would argue that I think they need running back more than wide receiver. And I would say the best player out of the running backs and wide receivers in this year's draft class, with the exception of Travis Hunter, is Ashton Jeanty. He's better than all the wide receivers. None of the wide receivers are better than him. They're not going to have the same impact. And I really like that Brock Bowers is here. I know I said that before, but it's really going to incentivize you to run the ball. He can block. And, using him in play action, slipping out when, they're going to be worried about the workhorse going one way. You're going to have Bowers, dragging to the other side of the field, having him wide open. It's going to be like pick your poison, right? Having him on split zone blocks and things like that, slipping out into the flat. It's going to be crazy. They're so worried about the running back. And I've kind of already telegraphed it to you. Ashton Jeanty and Brock Bowers going in 2 different directions, and you're the defensive coordinator. What do you do? Who do you leverage? You can't leverage either way. So now you're stalling and you're being held up. Now the wide receivers you can cover, but it's not them you're supposed to worry about. Either way, I've explained. Volume is king. The offensive line is pretty good. Now teams are going to be able to tee off just a bit on this running game, but I think if Brock Bowers can punish like the loaded boxes just enough, then I think this is a really, really good spot for a running back. Now, like I just said, the efficiency sort of depends on how reliable this offense can be, but we haven't seen this Raiders team, this offense and this offensive line operate with a quality quarterback of any time. So even though they will have the opportunity to pick up Ashton Jeanty, out of all the teams that could use a workhorse running back, this is definitely the place I would want to go to the least, even though it has improved in a lot of ways, like getting Geno Smith, and they do have like a decent enough offensive line, at least for run blocking. I just think the other three teams are definitely much better landing spots. The offense, I think, is going to score a lot more points. Of course, you'll get a ton of yards, carries on the ground, receptions, and receiving yards and things like that. But if you're not getting the touchdown volume, then it's just hard to catch up with those guys on those really good teams, especially if there's less competition for touchdowns. So this one with the Raiders and the Chiefs was really, really close, but I'm going to give the edge to the Raiders, and that's why they're my number 4 team. The upside, the ceiling, well, if they're really the only offensive weapon, I'm not going to put it, besides Bowers, I'm not going to put it outside of the range of outcomes for this guy to get like maybe 11 or 12 rushing touchdowns. I mean, that would be a lot. But if you also follow it up and say, well, I don't think any of their receivers are going to have more than 4 or 5 receiving touchdowns, well, then there you have that. And the 11 and 12 touchdowns, not rushing and receiving combined. Now for receiving yards, right? I mean, it's kind of hard to say, but I would say they're going to be losing probably more often than not. If I just had to guess off the top of my head, I don't think it'll be as bad though. Either way, I think this dude could get a ton of receptions. And if it is Ashton Genty, then oh my goodness, this dude could have 1,000 receiving yards off of like 80 receptions, right? He might have more receiving yards than he has rushing yards if the Raiders are not good. But hey, the floor, well, if Geno Smith gets hurt, we're not talking about that. If he stays on the field, then I don't know. I could, depending on who the running back is, it's tough to say. But if things just don't work out like they generally do for the Raiders, then I'd say probably still not getting any less than 6 rushing touchdowns, maybe 50 receptions for like 500 receiving yards, and like another 1 or 2 receiving touchdowns. So that's your ceiling and floor. Raiders 4th best landing spot for a running back. Up next, we've got my 3rd best landing spot for rookie running backs this year, and that is going to be the Dallas Cowboys. What do they need? As I stated, they need a workhorse. So let's talk about the Cowboys. What's the competition there? Well, they got Javonte Williams, who they just picked up, and Miles Sanders. For me, this is probably one of the easiest rooms to surpass the competition in. I think Javonte Williams has some talent, but with all the injuries over time, the age, I just think it's going to be tough for him to, get kept or prioritized moving forward. Same thing with Miles Sanders. He's a guy who was talented in the past, but just hasn't quite, had his stuff together in the past few years, and it really hasn't looked too good. For the Cowboys offensive line, it's going to be a new era for them. Zach Martin is gone, but they're hoping that the new guys cycling in are going to be able to produce back to, the way the offensive line used to be, where it was a top group in the league. And then just the surroundings of this guy. The culture is going to be brand new. Schottenheimer's the new head coach, but it is important to note that Clayton Adams, their new offensive coordinator, really loves to run the ball. So that is good because that's going to mesh well with their defense that prefers to be in the lead, of course, but also because they are so dependent on game script. They are a way better defense when they're winning than when they're losing. And then in terms of just like what else is there for the offense to kind of distract teams from this running back, well, you do have Dak and CD, which is, enough to worry about, but they don't have anything behind that. So if that gets swallowed up, then, the running back could very well get swallowed up too. But either way, the Cowboys really missed the days of Zeke, and they need a new one. This offensive line is going to be new. This new generation is stepping up. As I mentioned, Clayton Adams is going to love to run the ball. And for them to establish their new identity, I highly doubt that they're not going to want to pick up a running back in this year's class who's going to be considered their guy, leading the way of this new era. The passing game does need more weapons, but I think it's enough to support a running back, in a scheme like this, especially if they want to run the ball more often than not. Then you don't have to depend as much on your wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3. And the defense, it's going to be good enough to, support them in most situations. This is a wide open situation for a rookie running back to step into. They got the whole rest of the draft to address the defense and things like that. I'm not sure if they're going to go first round with this. They have a ton of needs in the trenches too. But say if Ashton Genty falls to 12, I see them taking him. If the guys they want in the trenches aren't there, I see them trading back, picking up a guy like Amari and Hampton. And I just really like the ceiling that this guy is going to have. I think, it's probably going to be more on the ground, but he's going to have enough receiving work too, considering there isn't many backup wide receivers. He's going to be like the second receiving threat. So I think a guy like Omari and Hampton going here would be really good. The ceiling would be tremendous. It would be like probably 15, not 15. Yeah, the ceiling would be 1,500 yards, I would say. Maybe like 8 touchdowns or something like that, 10 touchdowns. But then the receiving game as well, like another 40 receptions for maybe like 300 yards and like 2 receiving touchdowns or something crazy like that. That would be a really, really amazing rookie season. But the floor, well, if this new offensive line doesn't work out, maybe the running back isn't that great. They didn't, take a guy very high in the draft, and he's not quite as good as the other guys. Well, then I could see it being closer to like 700, 800 rushing yards, maybe like 6, 7 touchdowns still, because he is the workhorse. And then in the receiving game, maybe like 30 receptions, 200 yards, and a receiving touchdown. So probably a wider range of outcomes than you're hoping for, but that's where the risk comes in, and you have to, go ahead and take a chance on a guy like this. If you believe in the Cowboys' new offensive line, I would draft whoever their rookie running back is going to end up being. If you're not confident that their offensive line is going to work out, then I would tend to stay away from it, unless if they end up picking up more of a receiving back. And if they don't pick up anyone, then we'll talk about that when we get to the offseason. All right, but that's my number 3 best team is the Dallas Cowboys, and they need a workhorse. Moving on to our next team, this is my second best landing spot for running backs this year, and that's going to be the Denver Broncos. Of course, they need a workhorse. Who's the competition in their backfield? Well, they got Audric Estime, who's certainly a power back, and then they got Jaleel McLaughlin, who's certainly a receiving back. And you might be saying, well, why would they need a running back if they already have someone in both roles? Well, to be frank, they're not quite, impressed enough by the guys that they have right now. Of course, they still got potential, and they've kind of been getting the job done, but I really think that they'd like to have a true difference maker on this offense added with this first-round pick. Not to mention, the situation they would be stepping into is going to be really good. The offensive line is great. The defense, probably the best defense in the NFL, but next to the Eagles. The culture, Sean Payton loves to use his running backs. Everything that they've got on this team, everything they need, they have, except for running back, pretty much. So to me, this is a pretty obvious spot for them to just straight up go running back in the first round, trade up even if they feel like they have to. And I mentioned before, Sean Payton typically uses guys in the roles like Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara back in the days, Thunder and Lightning approach, but why not change it up? Since you already have role players on your team, you don't want to spend 2 draft picks on 2 different role players for running backs. I would just get one and have him get the job done. The passing game is going to be enough to distract defenses. In fact, it's kind of an extension of the run game. And with an elite defense, I think they would rely on this guy a ton. I mean, it just makes so much sense to me. Because, as I mentioned before, I think you're going to get more of an immediate impact out of the rookie running backs in the first round this year than you are out of the wide receivers. And if you're a team that's in the playoffs, who made it last year, and you've got a guy on a rookie contract, a quarterback. So this is also the Commanders too, but they've got Brian Robinson Jr. and Austin Eckler, who are definitely better than Estime and Jaleel McLaughlin. But the Broncos, they have a better offensive line. They have a better defense. I mean, it just makes so much sense for them to do this. And this guy is going to step in and immediately have the role, in my opinion. I mean, I think if they take Quinshon Judkins, Omari Hampton, Cam Scatterbu even, Caleb Johnson, I think they're going to step in, be a potential top 10 running back in fantasy right away because of just the sheer volume. This is going to be a good offense. They're going to rely on this guy for a ton of work near the goal line. And it's just he's probably going to be the best weapon on the offense day one. Of course, you got Cortland Sutton, you got Marvin Mims, and you got Troy Franklin as kind of the future of the receiving room. But I don't think Cortland Sutton at this point in his career is going to be the best weapon. These young wide receivers, Mims and Franklin, are still developing. And Sean Payton's going to figure out how to open up this run game with whoever this is. So to me, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. There's honestly not even too much to say because this is like almost the perfect example of the right situation for a rookie running back to step into. Oh, yeah, and one more point. Bo Nix has already proven that he's comfortable in the NFL, in my opinion. But you want to get him even more comfortable, give him a better run game, and just watch the magic happen, okay? With any young quarterback, if you want to make their lives easier, give them a run game and a running back who they can just hand the ball off to, or when there's pressure in the face, they can just dump it off to this guy. Makes their lives a hell of a lot easier. So that's my number 2 best landing spot for a running back in this year's draft class, the Denver Broncos, who need a workhorse. And finally, we are on to my very last team, my number 1 best landing spot, and that's going to be the Chicago Bears, who need a workhorse. Well, you might think this is a bit controversial. You might say, well, I'm thinking about the Bears right now, and the way you just talked about the Broncos, I think they're a better landing spot. And you might very well be right, but this is a projection. So, yes, not only are we going to have risk with a rookie running back, but we're going to have risk based off of my projection for this team, because a lot has changed for the Bears, whereas not a lot has changed for the Broncos based off of how last year ended. When the Bears ended last year, they were having an interim coach. They had a disaster season after taking Caleb Williams number 1 overall, where everything fell apart, and it was just very, very not good. Whereas the Broncos are riding high and everything like that. But the Bears, they just picked up Ben Johnson from the Lions as their new head coach. And that is the main driver for this. They already started off strong, establishing his identity for the team, basically overhauling the entire offensive line to the point that I wouldn't even be shocked if they went offensive line in the first round as well, just to get guys that they want across the whole line. And first of all, I love them doing this because this is going to change the team so drastically. I don't even think we're going to be able to recognize the Bears offense next year. Also, they have Caleb Williams, who, even though Bo Nix was fantastic, I think Caleb Williams has a higher ceiling. And with Ben Johnson, I think he finally has a coach who's on the same level as Sean Payton with the upgraded offensive line. And, the Bears defense was pretty good last year before everything fell apart. I think all the pieces are here for a running back to step into. It's not established like it is for the Broncos, but I think just with the variance, this guy's probably going to get projected lower, whoever the rookie is. Say we get Hampton here and Judkins to the Broncos, then Judkins would definitely be projected higher, I would think. That's what people would assume. But I'm going to go ahead and say I'm going to go with the Bears guy. Now, they already have DeAndre Swift and Roschon Johnson, who's definitely better than the Broncos competition. So that's kind of working against this guy, whoever ends up going here. But like I said, the offensive line, the culture and everything going there. We saw what happened when the Lions took Gibbs, even though they already had Montgomery. Whoever they take this year, they're going to believe he's basically going to be the RB1, okay? And I just really like I said, the value that's going to be here for this guy. And I think with the wide receivers they have a bit more of a chance to sort of break out as an offense and maybe even be a better offense than the Broncos. Also, not to mention, the Broncos defense is definitely better than the Bears. And it might even be so good that games are ending sooner. You're not forced to score because the other team just can't score against you. There's actually potentially less scoring opportunity for you as a running back. And you see how back and forth some of these criteria are. You're like, you said it was good to have a good defense, but not the best defense. Maybe if you're still great on offense and you want to just run up the score, you might go ahead and do that, but that's usually not the case. You usually can't afford to have the best defense in the league and that good of an offense, unless if you have a quarterback on a rookie contract. So very close between this Broncos team and this Bears team, but they are certainly in a tier of their own, in my opinion. The Cowboys are close because they are sort of lining up their cultural identity to be along these lines, but there's a lot more uncertainty with them. Whereas with the Bears, I am super confident that Ben Johnson is going to be able to get this team operating the way he wants to, running the ball, setting up play action, and all of those sorts of things. For Caleb Williams to help support him and help him grow, he's going to establish this run game first, this offensive line, make sure the defense is in tippy-top shape. They still have DJ Moore and Rome Odunze, so they're all set in the weapons category as far as wide receiver goes, and the only thing that they need is going to be running back. And I think based off of what we saw with the Lions, they might take one of the best ones too. So that sort of plays into this too, a little bit of projection there. But yeah, Bears and Broncos are almost tied. The Cowboys just behind them. And then at number 4, we had the Raiders, who also need a workhorse. Moving on to the more role player needy teams, we got the Chiefs, who need a receiving back Really, really like the upside. You guys all remember the years of Kareem Hunt and how good he was there. The Vikings, like I said, they need a power back. Would love to see a guy go there, get like 10 rushing touchdowns and 1,000 yards. Bengals, same sort of thing, except, potentially higher upside when it comes to scoring, but not as much when it comes to the yards. Chargers receiving back, kind of like an Eckler 2.0 to complement Najee Harris back when they had Melvin Gordon. And then for the Steelers, power back, they just need another one. I think it's something that they're going to go for. And a guy like this, going to a team like this with the culture, I think it's very easy to see what they're going to end up doing with him. All right, guys, that's going to be all for you today with this one. We've talked so far on the channel about my favorite rookie running backs coming out this year. And now we've talked about my favorite landing spots. So real quick, let's just do a quick little experiment and see how much we like the sound of these ideas. Ashton Genty to the Bears, Broncos, Cowboys, or Raiders. Really, really liking that, but I would really love to see him go to the Bears or Broncos. That would be awesome. I'm sure he'd be, a star on the Cowboys too. But also, same thing goes for like Omari and Hampton and Quinshon Judkins. For the lower teams that just need receiving backs and power backs, Trevion Henderson or Travis Etienne going to the Chiefs. Trevor Etienne, excuse me, his brother, going to the Chiefs, who need a receiving back, the Chargers, and then for your power backs, your Cam Scadaboos, your Damian Martinez's. The Steelers need one, the Bengals, and the Vikings. So those would be my ideal situations. And yeah, like I said, really excited for this year's offseason, especially after the draft when we get to talk real fantasy football ADPs, dynasty, redraft, underdog. I really want to get into that a lot more. I know we've been doing player evaluation for like the draft and stuff like that, but I definitely want to make more of a shift towards fantasy football, as I think I can make better content for you guys that way. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to subscribe. If you came all the way here looking for more content, you must be really committed. So I promise you I'll get you more, and you can stay tuned and keep up with that if you are subscribed. Tell me in the comments, where do you disagree with this list? I have 9 teams for you. I have them in a certain order. Maybe you see a different team I don't have on here belonging in here. I kind of doubt that, but you probably disagree with the order. So maybe you do think the Broncos are the best landing spot over the Bears. So if you think that, tell me in the comments. And then last but not least, please drop a like on the video. If you did enjoy it, it's the least you could do to help me out. Just one click is all it takes. And like I said, it will help support the channel. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.